I didn't scream when he grabbed my wrist. I screamed when I realized I had nowhere left to go. The rain hitting the pavement so hard it sounded like applause for a life falling apart. And 3 hours earlier, I was still inside the restaurant pretending everything was normal, balancing a tray of glasses while the smell of espresso and lemon cleaner filled the air, telling myself if I just made it through another shift I could keep things from breaking completely, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and I kept tugging my sleeve down over my arm like fabric could hide the truth, like anyone who really looked wouldn't see it anyway. Except someone did, because in the far corner of the dining room, where the lighting turned softer and the voices dropped lower, he was watching me. Dominic Russo, a name I didn't know yet, but felt before I understood, the kind of presence that made other people move without being asked, the kind that didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. And when I stumbled slightly near his table, just enough for one glass to tilt dangerously, his hand moved fast, steadying the tray before anything could fall, his fingers brushing mine for half a second too long. Not careless, not accidental, intentional. And his eyes dropped to my wrist where the edge of my sleeve had slipped back just enough to reveal what I'd been hiding all night. And everything in the room seemed to go quiet, even though the music never stopped, even though people kept talking. Because the way he looked at me made it feel like there was nothing else in the world but that moment. "Who did that to you?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, not loud but impossible to ignore, and I pulled my arm back like I'd been burned, forcing a laugh that didn't sound like mine. "It's nothing, just clumsy." But he didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his gaze didn't leave my face, like he was reading something written beneath my skin. And for a second, I thought he might say more, might push, might make me admit something I wasn't ready to admit. But instead he reached into his jacket and placed a small black card on the table, sliding it toward me with a quiet precision that felt heavier than any words. "If you ever need help," he said, and that was it. No pressure, no explanation, just a statement that sounded less like an offer and more like a certainty, like he already knew I would need it. And I hated that. Hated the way it made my chest tighten, hated the way it felt like he could see through every lie I told myself just to get through the day. So I nodded, took the card without looking at it, and walked away as fast as I could without running, telling myself I would throw it away later, that I didn't need help, that I could handle my own life. But even as I cleared tables and forced smiles and counted tips, I could feel his eyes on me, not following, not chasing, just there, steady, waiting. And when my shift finally ended, when the lights dimmed and the last customers left and the world outside turned cold and empty, I stepped into the alley behind the restaurant because it was faster than going around front, because I always took shortcuts when I was tired, because I thought I still had control over where I went. And that's when I heard footsteps behind me, familiar ones, the kind that made my stomach drop before my mind could catch up. And I knew before I turned around that tonight wasn't going to end quietly. Not the way I'd hoped, not the way I'd promised myself it would. And suddenly that small black card felt heavier in my pocket than anything I'd ever carried, like a choice I hadn't realized I was going to have to make. The moment I turned around, I knew exactly how the night was going to unfold, not because anything had happened yet, but because his presence always carried that weight, that quiet pressure that made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. And there he was leaning against the brick wall like he had been waiting for me all along, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes locked on mine with that familiar mix of control and expectation that had followed me for months. "You took the back exit again," he said, voice calm in a way that never felt safe, and I forced myself to keep my voice steady even though my pulse was already racing. I just wanted to get home. But he stepped closer, not fast, not aggressive. Just enough to close the space between us, enough that I could feel the tension settle into my shoulders, and I hated how predictable it all felt, how my body already knew the pattern before my mind could catch up, the questions, the accusations, the way he twisted normal things into something I had to defend. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered the card in my pocket, the weight of it pressing against my leg like a reminder I did not want to acknowledge. "Who was that guy?" he asked, and I blinked, confused for a second before realizing he meant Dominic, the man in the corner, the one who had seen too much without saying much at all. "Just a customer," I said quickly, too quickly, and his eyes narrowed slightly, not convinced, never convinced, You think I did not notice the way he looked at you, he continued. His tone still level but sharper now, like something beneath the surface was tightening, and I shook my head, trying to keep everything from escalating, trying to keep the fragile balance I had been walking for so long. It was nothing. I was just doing my job. But he stepped even closer, and I could feel the familiar pressure building, the kind that made my thoughts scatter and my breathing shallow. And I told myself to stay calm, to not react, because reacting always made things worse. But my arm brushed against his as I shifted my weight, and the sudden jolt of pain shot up to my shoulder so sharply that I could not stop the small sound that escaped my lips, and everything froze for half a second, his eyes dropping to my arm, then back to my face, calculating, reading, and I knew that look, knew it meant something had shifted, something I could not control anymore. What is wrong with your arm? He asked, and I swallowed hard, shaking my head even though the movement made the pain spike again. Nothing. I just twisted it earlier. But he reached out, not violently, not harshly, just enough to test, to confirm, and the pressure was enough to make me inhale sharply. And that was all it took. The moment stretched, silent and heavy, before he stepped back slightly, his expression changing into something colder, something final, like a decision had been made. And I realized then that this was the breaking point. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift that meant everything was about to change. And for the first time all night, maybe for the first time in months, I felt something different rise up inside me. Not fear, not panic, something sharper, clearer, like the part of me that had been quiet for too long was finally waking up, and my hand moved before I could second guess it, slipping into my pocket, fingers brushing against the smooth edge of the card, and I hesitated for a second, just one, because calling that number meant crossing a line I could not uncross, meant admitting I needed help, meant trusting someone I did not understand. But then I looked at him, really looked, and I saw it clearly, the pattern, the cycle, the version of my life that would not change if I stayed where I was. And my hesitation disappeared, replaced by something steady, something certain, and without saying another word, I stepped back, putting distance between us for the first time, pulling my phone out with shaking hands. And as his expression shifted from confusion to something sharper, I dialed the number from memory, not because I had tried to remember it, but because somehow it had stayed with me, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. And when the line connected, I lifted the phone to my ear, my voice barely above a whisper but stronger than I felt. Can you come get me? And the silence on the other end lasted just long enough for doubt to creep in, just long enough for me to wonder if I had made a mistake, until his voice came through, calm, controlled, exactly the same as before. Where are you? And I realized then that everything had already started changing the second I made that call. The moment I said it, the world seemed to hold its breath, like everything around me was waiting to see if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life or the first right decision in a long time. And I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and questioning, trying to understand what I had just done, but I did not look at him. I kept my gaze forward, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. Because if I looked back, even for a second, I might lose whatever strength had carried me this far. Stay where you are. Dominic's voice came through again, steady, controlled, not a hint of hesitation, and there was something about the way he said it that made my racing thoughts slow just a little. Like for the first time that night, I was not completely alone, and I swallowed, forcing myself to answer, giving him the name of the street, the alley behind the restaurant, my voice quieter now, but still holding, still steady enough to be understood. And when the call ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, thicker, charged with something unspoken, and I knew he was still there, still watching me, still trying to piece together what had just happened. Who did you just call? He asked, and his voice had changed, not louder, not angrier, but tighter, like something inside him had shifted in a way I had not seen before. And I shook my head slightly, taking another small step back, creating distance again, holding on to it this time. It does not matter, I said, and the words felt strange coming out of my mouth, unfamiliar but solid, like they belonged to someone stronger than the person I had been an hour ago. And for a moment he just stared at me, like he was deciding what to do next, like he was weighing options I could not see. And I felt the seconds stretch, each one pressing against my chest, each one making it harder to breathe, until I heard it, faint at first, then clearer, the low hum of an engine turning into the alley, smooth, controlled, deliberate, and I did not need to turn around to know who it was. I felt it before I saw it. The shift in the air, the quiet change that made everything else feel smaller, less important, and when the black SUV rolled to a stop just a few yards away, headlights cutting through the darkness without blinding, just enough to illuminate the space between us. Everything inside me stilled, like the chaos that had been building all night had suddenly found something stronger to answer to. The driver's door opened first, then the passenger side. Two men stepping out in dark suits, moving with a kind of calm precision that did not need to be explained. And then he stepped out, Dominic Russo. Exactly as I remembered, exactly as I did not. Because outside the restaurant, outside the soft lighting and quiet conversations, he felt different, larger somehow, like the world bent slightly around him instead of the other way around. And his eyes found mine immediately, not scanning, not searching, just finding, like he had known exactly where I would be standing the moment he arrived, and for a second, everything else disappeared. The alley, the cold, the tension behind me, all of it fading under the weight of that gaze. And then he looked past me, just briefly, just enough to acknowledge the other presence in the space, before his attention returned to me completely, and he walked forward, slow, deliberate steps closing the distance without hesitation, stopping just close enough that I could see every detail, the sharp line of his jaw, the calm in his expression, the complete lack of doubt in the way he held himself. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but somehow stronger. "You should have called me sooner." And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my shoulders dropping slightly, the tension easing just enough to feel it. And I shook my head. A small, almost automatic movement. I did not think I could, I admitted, and his expression shifted just slightly. Something softer flickering beneath the control, something that did not erase the power but changed the way it felt, less distant, more focused, and he reached out, not to grab, not to pull, just to gently take my uninjured hand, his touch firm but careful, grounding in a way I had not expected. "You can," he said simply, like it was not a question, like it had never been one. And in that moment, standing there with the sound of the engine still running behind him and the night stretching out around us, I realized something that should have terrified me but did not, something that settled deep in my chest with a strange, quiet certainty. I had not just asked him to come get me. I had stepped into something I did not fully understand, something I might not be able to walk away from. And for the first time, that thought did not feel like a trap, it felt like a choice. For a second, I forgot he was still there behind me, forgot everything except the way Dominic's hand felt around mine, steady and certain, like he was anchoring me to something solid after hours of trying to stay upright on my own. But the tension did not disappear. It shifted, thickened, pressing into the space between all three of us, and I could feel it again, that familiar weight at my back, the presence that had controlled my every move for so long. "Emily," he said, my name sharp now, edged with something that had finally lost its patience, and I closed my eyes for half a second, just long enough to steady my breathing, just long enough to remind myself that I had already made a different choice. And when I opened them again, I did not turn around, I did not pull my hand away, I did not step back, because for the first time, I did not feel like I had to, and Dominic's grip shifted slightly, not tightening, not claiming, just adjusting, like he understood exactly what this moment required without me having to say a word. And when he finally turned his head, acknowledging the other man fully for the first time, it was not dramatic, not aggressive, just a quiet shift in attention that somehow carried more weight than anything loud ever could. "You should leave," Dominic said, his voice calm, even, like he was stating something obvious, something already decided, and I felt the words settle into the air, heavy and final, and for a moment, nothing happened, the kind of pause that stretches long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough to make you question what comes next, until I heard a small, humorless laugh behind me, the kind that did not carry warmth, only disbelief. "You think you can just walk in and tell me what to do," he said, and I could hear the edge in his voice now, the frustration, the loss of control he was not used to feeling, and I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around Dominic's hand without thinking, because even though I had stepped into something new. The old fear had not disappeared completely. It was still there, quieter now but present, lingering at the edges of my thoughts, and Dominic must have felt it, because his thumb moved once, a small, almost absent gesture against my skin, grounding, steadying, pulling me back from that edge before I could fall into it again. And when he spoke this time, his voice did not change. It did not need to. "I am not telling you," he said, and there was a slight pause, just enough to make the next words land harder. "I am giving you a chance." And something in the air shifted again. Something subtle but undeniable, like the balance of the moment had tilted in a way that could not be undone. And I finally turned my head slightly, just enough to see him from the corner of my eye. The way his posture had changed, the way uncertainty had crept in where confidence used to sit. And for the first time since I had known him, he looked unsure, not afraid, not yet, but uncertain in a way that made everything feel different. Like the version of him I had built my life around was not as unshakable as I had believed, and that realization hit me harder than anything else that night, because it meant I had been living inside something smaller than I thought, something that only felt big because I had never stepped outside of it before. And Dominic stepped slightly closer to me then, not blocking, not shielding, just placing himself firmly at my side, equal, present, and I realized he was not trying to take control of the situation for me. He was changing the conditions so I could choose differently, and that was something I had never experienced before. Not like this, not with this kind of quiet certainty behind it. And the silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier, until finally I heard footsteps, not approaching, not closing in, but moving away, slow at first, then more certain, until the sound faded into the distance, and the alley felt different again, emptier, lighter in a way I did not recognize right away. And I let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs, something that had been held back for far too long finally releasing. And I did not realize my grip had tightened until Dominic shifted slightly, his attention returning fully to me, his expression softer now, but no less focused. "Can you walk?" he asked, and I nodded automatically before the pain in my arm reminded me of its presence, a sharp, grounding ache that pulled me back into my body, back into the reality of everything that had happened. And he noticed, of course he noticed, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to my face, assessing, calculating in a way that did not feel cold. It felt precise, like he was already planning the next step before I even understood what it should be. And then, without hesitation, he reached for the car door, opening it with one smooth movement. "Come with me," he said, not a command, not a demand, just a statement that felt inevitable, like the next chapter had already started the moment I made that call. And as I stood there for a second longer, looking at the open door, at the warm light spilling out from inside the car, I realized that walking away from that alley was not just about leaving a place. It was about leaving a version of myself behind. And when I finally stepped forward, I did not look back. The door closed softly behind me, sealing out the cold air of the alley like it had never existed. And for a moment, I just sat there, hands in my lap, staring at nothing while the world shifted into something quieter, something controlled. The interior of the car warm, dimly lit, the faint scent of leather, and something clean replacing the sharp smell of rain and concrete. And I realized how loud everything had been before, how tense my body had been without me fully noticing it. Because now that I was sitting here, with the door shut and the engine humming steadily beneath us, the silence felt almost unfamiliar, like stepping into a place where chaos was not allowed to follow. And I could feel Dominic beside me, not crowding, not overwhelming, just present in a way that grounded everything around him. And when the car began to move, smooth and effortless, I finally let out a breath I had been holding for what felt like hours, my shoulders dropping slightly as the tension eased, just enough to notice it. But the ache in my arm pulled me back quickly, a sharp reminder that this was not over, that I had not just walked away from something small. And I shifted slightly, trying to find a position that did not send another wave of pain through me. But it was impossible to ignore completely. And of course he noticed, because he noticed everything, his gaze flicking briefly toward my arm before returning to my face, measuring, assessing. And then he spoke, his voice low but clear. "How long has it been like this?" And I hesitated, not because I did not understand the question, but because I did not know how to answer it in a way that made sense outside of my own head. How do you explain something that built slowly over time, something that did not start as something you would walk away from, something that changed so gradually you did not realize how far it had gone until you were already in too deep? And I looked down at my hands, at the faint tremor that had not fully gone away, and I shook my head slightly. I do not know, I admitted quietly, and the honesty of it surprised me, because I had spent so long pretending I did know, pretending I had control over something that clearly had been controlling me, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not pressing, just there, giving space for the words I had not said yet. And I felt his attention shift again, not away, never away, but softer somehow, like he understood more than I had told him, like he did not need every detail to see the truth of it. And the car turned onto a wider street, the city lights stretching out around us in long reflections on the wet pavement, buildings passing by, in a blur of gold and shadow. And I realized I did not recognize where we were going, not exactly. But I also realized I was not asking, because for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to predict the next move. I was just letting it happen, letting myself exist in a moment that did not feel like something I had to manage or survive. And that realization was almost as overwhelming as everything that had come before it, because it felt unfamiliar in a way that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. And Dominic shifted slightly in his seat, reaching forward just enough to speak quietly to the driver, giving an address I did not catch, his voice calm, precise, and then he leaned back again, his attention returning fully to me. "We're going to take care of that," he said, nodding once toward my arm. And there was no question in his tone, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that made it sound like a fact rather than a plan, and I swallowed, my fingers curling slightly into the fabric of my sleeve. "You do not have to," I said automatically, the words coming out before I could stop them, because that was what I was used to saying, what I had trained myself to believe, that needing something was the same as asking too much. And his expression changed just slightly, not irritation, not frustration, something closer to disbelief, like the idea itself did not make sense to him. "I know," he said simply, and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from something else, something I did not have a name for yet. "I am choosing to," he added, and the words settled into the space between us, heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they shifted something fundamental, something I had not realized I was still holding on to, the idea that help always came with a cost, that it was something you had to earn or repay. And for a moment, I did not know how to respond, because I had never been given something like that without conditions attached. And I looked at him, really looked this time, at the calm in his expression, at the complete absence of doubt in the way he held himself, and I realized that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, it was not something I could measure by the same rules I had been living by before. And the car slowed slightly as we approached a building I did not recognize, tall and quiet, lights glowing softly through large windows. And as we came to a stop, Dominic reached for the door again, opening it with the same smooth precision as before, stepping out first before turning back toward me, offering his hand once more, not pulling, not insisting, just there, waiting. And as I looked at it, at the steady way he held it out, I realized that taking it was not about needing help anymore. It was about choosing something different. And this time, I did not hesitate. The moment my hand settled into his again, something inside me went quiet. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice the difference. Enough to feel the shift as he helped me step out of the car and onto smooth concrete that still held the warmth of the building lights above. The entrance towering in front of us with glass doors that reflected back a version of me I barely recognized, hair damp from the rain, clothes slightly wrinkled from a night that had stretched too long, eyes wide but no longer lost. And for a second I hesitated, not because I wanted to go back, but because I realized there was no version of my life where I would have walked into a place like this before tonight, not with someone like him, not like this. And he noticed, of course he noticed, his hand shifting slightly, not pulling, not urging, just steady, waiting for me to decide. And I took a breath before stepping forward, letting the doors open automatically as we approached, the warm air inside wrapping around me like a barrier between the world I had left and the one I was stepping into. The lobby quiet, polished, everything in its place in a way that felt intentional rather than showy. And I could feel eyes on us, not curious, not questioning, just aware, like his presence explained everything that needed to be understood without a single word spoken, and we moved through the space without stopping. His pace unhurried but direct, like there was never any doubt about where we were going, and I followed without asking, because I realized I trusted the direction more than I trusted my own instincts right now. And that thought should have unsettled me, but it did not. It felt like relief, like letting go of something I had been holding too tightly for too long. And the elevator doors opened before we even reached them, someone inside nodding once before stepping out, leaving the space empty for us, and we stepped in. The doors closing softly behind us, sealing us into a quieter kind of silence, one that felt different from the car, more contained, more focused, and I leaned slightly against the wall, careful of my arm, the ache still present but dulled now by everything else, by the shift in my surroundings, by the weight of the moment settling in. And he pressed a button without looking, his movements precise, practiced, and then his attention returned to me fully, his gaze steady but not overwhelming, like he was giving me space to adjust while still making it clear he was there. And for a few seconds neither of us spoke, the hum of the elevator filling the silence as it carried us upward. And I realized I did not feel the need to fill that silence, did not feel the need to explain or justify or soften anything. I just existed there, breathing, letting the moment unfold without trying to control it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, more measured. "There is a doctor upstairs," he said, not as a warning, not as a question, just information, and I nodded, the simple statement grounding me in what came next. Because as much as everything had shifted emotionally, physically my body still needed care, still needed something I could not give myself. And the elevator slowed before coming to a smooth stop, the doors opening onto a hallway that felt even quieter than the lobby, the lighting softer, the air calmer, like this floor existed separate from the rest of the building. And we stepped out, his hand still loosely holding mine until we reached a door at the end of the hall, where he paused for just a second before opening it, stepping aside slightly to let me enter first, and I hesitated again, just briefly, not from fear this time, but from the realization that each step forward was taking me further away from the life I had known, further into something I did not fully understand yet. And then I stepped inside, the room warm and softly lit, not cold or clinical like I expected, but calm, almost comforting, and a man in a white coat looked up from where he stood, his expression shifting instantly from neutral to attentive when he saw us. Not surprised, not startled, just ready, like he had been expecting me, and I felt something tighten in my chest again, not from fear, but from the realization that Dominic had not just reacted to my call, he had anticipated it, prepared for it in a way that meant I had never been as alone as I thought. And as the door closed quietly behind us, sealing out the rest of the world once more, I realized that tonight was not just about being saved from something. It was about being seen in a way I had never allowed before, and I was not sure yet what that would mean, only that it had already begun. The doctor did not ask questions right away, and that was the first thing I noticed, the way he simply stepped closer with calm, measured movements, his eyes scanning my arm with quiet focus instead of curiosity, like he had seen situations like this before and understood that explanations could wait. And I stood there for a second, unsure where to put my hands, unsure how to exist in a space where I was not being rushed or dismissed or told I was overreacting, and Dominic remained just behind me, not hovering, not interrupting, just present in a way that made the room feel steadier, like nothing here would spiral out of control. And the doctor gestured gently toward a chair. "Have a seat," he said, his tone even, professional but not cold, and I nodded, lowering myself carefully, my movements slower now as the dull ache in my arm reminded me that I could not ignore it any longer. And as I sat, I became aware of how tired I was, not just physically, but in a deeper way, like my body had been holding tension for so long that it did not know how to release it all at once. And the doctor moved closer, examining my arm with careful precision, his touch light but deliberate, and I flinched slightly before I could stop myself, the reaction automatic, and his expression softened just enough to acknowledge it without making it a moment. "I am going to take a closer look," he said quietly, giving me time to prepare instead of surprising me, and I nodded again, focusing on my breathing, on the steady rhythm of it as I tried to stay present. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dominic shift slightly, not stepping in, not interfering, but his attention sharpening in a way that made it clear he noticed every reaction, every small movement, like nothing about this was insignificant to him. And the doctor continued his assessment, asking a few simple questions when the pain started, how it felt, whether I could move my fingers, and I answered as best as I could, my voice quieter now but steady, because for the first time I did not feel like I needed to minimize it, did not feel like I needed to pretend it was less than it was, and that alone felt like a shift I could not fully explain. And after a few minutes, the doctor stepped back slightly, nodding once as if confirming something to himself. It needs support, but it is manageable, he said, his tone calm, reassuring without being dismissive, and I felt a small release in my chest, something loosening that I had not realized was still tight. And he moved to gather supplies, preparing what he needed with quiet efficiency, and I watched him for a moment, the simple normalcy of the action grounding in a way I had not expected, because everything about tonight had been so intense, so heightened, and this was different. This was controlled, predictable, and I realized how much I needed that, even if I had not known it before. And Dominic stepped slightly closer then, just enough that I could feel his presence more clearly again, and when I looked up at him, his expression had not changed much, still calm, still composed, but there was something else there now, something more focused, more personal, like he was not just observing the situation, he was invested in it in a way that went beyond obligation. And that realization settled into me slowly, layering over everything else I was feeling, and the doctor returned, beginning to carefully support my arm, explaining each step before he did it, making sure I understood what was happening, and I followed his instructions, breathing through the discomfort, focusing on the steadiness of the process rather than the ache itself. And at some point, I realized my hand had curled slightly into the edge of the chair, my fingers gripping without me meaning to. And then there was a subtle shift, Dominic's hand, resting lightly over mine, not restraining, not holding tight, just there, a quiet reassurance that I was not going through this alone, and I exhaled slowly, the tension easing just a little more. And when the doctor finally finished, stepping back to assess his work, the room felt different again, not heavy, not overwhelming, just settled, like something had been put back into place. And I looked down at my arm, now supported, no longer left to carry the weight on its own, and I realized that the same could be said for more than just the injury. And as I lifted my gaze again, meeting Dominic's eyes, I understood something I had not been ready to admit before. This was not just about one night or one decision. It was about everything that came after, and I was already standing inside it. For a moment after the doctor stepped back, everything felt still, like the room itself was waiting for me to understand what had just happened, not just the way my arm was now supported and no longer throbbing with every small movement, but the way something inside me had shifted just as quietly, just as deliberately. And I sat there, looking down at the careful wrap, the clean lines of it, the way it held everything in place without forcing it, and I realized how different that felt from everything I had known before, because nothing here was rushed, nothing was chaotic, everything had intention. And that thought lingered as I slowly lifted my gaze again, my eyes finding Dominic where he stood just a step away, his posture unchanged but his attention still entirely on me, like nothing else in the room mattered until he was certain I was steady. And the doctor spoke again, his voice calm and informative, explaining what I should expect over the next few days, how to rest, what to avoid, simple instructions delivered with clarity that made it easy to follow. And I nodded as he spoke, absorbing the words, but part of my mind stayed fixed on the presence beside me, on the way Dominic had not once looked away, not once treated this as something temporary or inconvenient. And when the doctor finished, offering a final reassurance before stepping back, I felt something settle into place inside me, something that felt like the beginning of understanding, and Dominic moved. Then, just slightly, his hand returning to mine in that same steady, grounding way, not asking, not hesitating, just there, and I stood slowly, adjusting to the new balance, the slight difference in how my body felt now, supported where it had been strained, and for a second I swayed, just barely, the fatigue catching up with me all at once. But his grip steadied me immediately, firm enough to hold, gentle enough not to overwhelm, and I let out a slow breath, realizing how close I had been to unraveling completely before this, how thin the line had been, and how easily I could have crossed it if things had gone even slightly differently. And that thought made me look at him again. Really look this time, not just at the surface, not just at the control and the quiet authority, but at the consistency beneath it, the way everything he did carried the same intention, the same certainty, and I realized that was what felt so different, so unfamiliar, because nothing about him was unpredictable in the way I had grown used to. Nothing felt like it could turn without warning, and that steadiness was something I had not known I was missing until now. And the silence stretched between us for a moment, not uncomfortable, not empty, just full of everything I had not said yet. Everything I was still trying to understand. And finally I spoke, my voice softer than before but clearer. Why did you come so fast? And the question felt heavier than it sounded, because it carried everything behind it. All the doubt, all the confusion, all the disbelief that someone would respond like that without hesitation. And he did not answer right away, not because he did not have one, but because he seemed to consider how to say it, his gaze steady on mine. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unwavering. Because you asked. And for a second I just looked at him, the simplicity of the answer almost disorienting, because it was not complicated, it was not layered with conditions or expectations, it was direct in a way that left no room for doubt. And something in my chest tightened again, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of that realization, because it meant that what I had done mattered, that the choice to reach out had changed. Something real, something immediate, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around his hand again, not from panic, not from instinct, but from something closer to trust, something I was only just beginning to recognize. And he noticed, of course he noticed, his thumb moving once more in that subtle, grounding way. And then he turned slightly toward the door, his posture shifting just enough to indicate what came next without forcing it. You are not going back there tonight, he said. And it was not a question, not a suggestion, just a statement that felt as steady as everything else he had said. And I did not argue, did not hesitate, because the idea of returning to that place, to that version of my life, felt distant now, like something I had already stepped away from, even if I had not fully processed it yet. And I nodded once, the movement small but certain, and as he guided me toward the door, his presence still steady at my side, I realized that this was not just about leaving somewhere unsafe. It was about stepping into something I had never allowed myself to consider before, something that did not feel fragile or temporary, something that held. And as we moved out into the quiet hallway again, the door closing softly behind us, I understood that, whatever this was, whatever I had just chosen, it was only beginning. The hallway felt quieter than before, like the world outside that room had paused just long enough for me to catch up with everything that had changed. And as we walked side by side, I became aware of how different my steps felt now, slower, more deliberate, not rushed or reactive, just present, and his pace adjusted without effort, matching mine without drawing attention to it, like it was the most natural thing in the world to move with me instead of ahead of me. And that small detail stayed with me longer than I expected, because it was not something I had ever experienced before, not like this, not without having to ask for it. And the elevator doors opened again before we reached them, the same quiet precision as before, and we stepped inside, the soft hum returning as the doors closed, sealing us into that contained space once more. And I leaned back slightly, careful of my arm, my gaze drifting to the reflection in the mirrored wall, and for a second I did not recognize the person looking back, not because I looked different on the surface, but because something in my expression had shifted, something steadier, less guarded, like I was no longer bracing for something that had not happened yet. And I exhaled slowly, watching that version of myself breathe instead of hold everything in. And beside me, Dominic remained still, his presence constant, not demanding attention but impossible to ignore. And I realized I had not asked where we were going next, had not questioned what came after this. And that thought surfaced quietly, not as panic, not as fear, but as curiosity, something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. Where are we going? I asked, my voice softer now but clear, and he turned his head slightly toward me. his gaze steady as always. "Somewhere you can rest," he answered, and the simplicity of it made something in my chest tighten again. Not painfully, just enough to feel it, because rest had never been something I could rely on. It had always been temporary, conditional, something that could be interrupted at any moment. And yet the way he said it made it sound like a certainty, like something already secured, and I nodded slowly, accepting the answer without needing more detail, because for the first time I believed it did not need to be complicated to be real. And the elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening onto the lobby once more, but it felt different now, not intimidating, not overwhelming, just another space we were passing through, and we stepped out together, his hand still loosely guiding mine, not controlling. Just there, and I noticed how people moved as we walked, how conversations softened, how attention shifted without being obvious, like his presence carried an understanding that did not need to be spoken. And I wondered, briefly, what it must be like to live like that, to move through the world without having to prove anything, without having to explain your place in it. And before I could follow that thought further, we were outside again, the night air cooler now, but no longer harsh, just present. And the car was already waiting, the door opening as we approached, and I paused for a second before getting in, not because I was unsure, but because I realized I was no longer reacting. I was choosing each step, each movement, each decision, and that realization settled into me quietly, grounding me in a way I did not expect. And when I slid into the seat, it felt different this time, not like an escape, not like something I was being pulled into, but like something I was stepping into on my own terms. And he followed a moment later, the door closing softly behind him. And as the car began to move again, I let my head rest back slightly, the exhaustion finally catching up with me in a way that felt safe instead of overwhelming. And the city lights blurred past the window, reflections stretching across the glass like something distant and fading. And I realized how far away everything felt already. The alley, the tension, the version of me that had stood there unsure of what to do. And I closed my eyes for a second, just long enough to feel the difference, just long enough to let it settle. And when I opened them again, I turned slightly toward him, my voice quieter now but certain. "What happens tomorrow?" And the question hung there between us, not heavy, not urgent, just real. Because for the first time, tomorrow felt like something I might actually have a say in. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window before returning to me. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying that same quiet certainty that had followed him from the moment he arrived. "Tomorrow, you start over." And the words settled into the space between us, simple but weighty, and I felt something inside me shift again, something deeper this time, something that made the idea of tomorrow feel less like something to survive and more like something to step into. And as the car moved through the city, carrying us somewhere I had never been before, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid of what came next. The word tomorrow stayed with me longer than I expected, echoing quietly in the space between my thoughts as the car moved steadily through the city, each passing streetlight casting brief shadows across the window. And I found myself watching them without really seeing, my mind catching on that one idea, that simple promise, because it felt unfamiliar in a way that was difficult to explain, not frightening, not overwhelming, just new, like a door I had never considered opening before was now standing in front of me, and I did not yet know what it would take to walk through it. And beside me, Dominic remained as steady as ever, his presence unchanged, not filling the silence but holding it in place so it did not collapse into something uncomfortable. And I realized I was not used to silence like this, silence that did not need to be managed, that did not carry tension or expectation, just space. And I leaned my head slightly against the seat, careful not to shift my arm too much, the support holding it in place reminding me with every small movement that this was real, that everything that had happened tonight had not been something I imagined or exaggerated. It had been enough to change something fundamental, and I exhaled slowly, letting that settle, letting the weight of it spread out instead of pressing down. And after a few minutes, the car slowed, turning into a quieter street lined with buildings that felt more private, less crowded, the kind of place where everything seemed intentionally removed from the noise of the rest of the city. And I straightened slightly, my attention returning to the present as the car came to a smooth stop in front of a building that looked nothing like anywhere I had ever lived, tall but not imposing. The lights inside warm rather than harsh. The entrance understated but clearly maintained. And for a second, I just looked at it, taking in the difference without trying to compare it to anything else, because there was no comparison that made sense. And the door opened, the driver stepping out before moving to open my side. But Dominic was already there, his hand reaching for the door first, holding it open as he turned toward me, his expression unchanged but his attention focused entirely on me. "We are here," he said quietly, and I nodded, even though the words felt larger than they sounded, because being here meant something. It marked a shift I could not undo, and I placed my hand in his again, letting him guide me out of the car, my steps slower, but steadier now, the ground beneath me solid in a way that felt grounding instead of uncertain. And as we approached the entrance, the doors opened without hesitation, like we had been expected, like this moment had already been accounted for before I even knew it would happen. And we stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around me again, the quiet of the space settling over everything else, and I became aware of how different my breathing felt, deeper, more even, like my body was finally beginning to understand that it did not need to stay on edge, at least not here. And we moved through the lobby without stopping, the same subtle shift in attention following us as before, people noticing without staring, acknowledging without questioning, and I realized that this was part of his world, this controlled, intentional environment where everything had a place and nothing was left to chance, and I wondered what it meant to belong in a space like that, to exist in it without feeling out of place. And before I could follow that thought too far, we reached another elevator, smaller this time, more private, and he pressed a button without hesitation, the doors closing quickly, sealing us into that contained space once more, and I turned slightly toward him, the question forming before I could stop it. "Do you always know what is going to happen next?" I asked, my voice quiet but genuine, because everything about him suggested that he did, that he moved through the world with a certainty I had never experienced. And he looked at me for a moment, his gaze steady, considering, and then he shook his head once, a small movement that felt more significant than it should have. "No," he said simply, and I blinked, surprised by the answer, because it did not match what I had expected. And he continued, his voice calm, measured, "I just make sure I am ready when it does." And something about that settled into me immediately, not because it answered everything, but because it made something clearer, something I had not understood before. That control was not about knowing every outcome. It was about choosing how to respond when things changed, and I let out a slow breath, the idea taking shape in my mind as the elevator slowed again, the doors opening onto a hallway that felt quieter than any we had passed through so far, more personal, more contained, and he stepped out first this time, turning slightly to make sure I followed, and I did, without hesitation, because by now I understood that each step forward was not something being decided for me. It was something I was choosing alongside him. And as we walked toward a door at the end of the hall, I felt something settle into place inside me, something that felt like the beginning of something steady, something real. And when he opened the door and stepped aside to let me enter, I realized that tomorrow was no longer something distant. It had already started. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it again, that quiet shift that had been following me since I got into the car. Like every space I entered with him carried the same unspoken promise, that nothing here would fall apart without warning. And I paused just inside the doorway, taking in the room slowly, the soft lighting, the clean lines, the kind of order that did not feel forced but intentional. And for a second I did not move, not because I was unsure, but because I realized I did not know how to exist in a place where I did not have to anticipate the next problem, where I did not have to calculate every move before making it. And behind me, I heard the door close quietly, sealing the space in that same controlled calm I was beginning to recognize, and I turned slightly, just enough to see him as he stepped further inside, his presence filling the room without overwhelming it, like everything adjusted around him instead of competing with him. And he did not speak right away, did not rush me, just gave me the space to take it in, to adjust at my own pace. And that alone felt unfamiliar in a way that settled deeper than anything else had so far. And I walked a few steps forward, my movements slower now, not from pain but from awareness, noticing the details, The way the floor felt steady beneath my feet, the way the air felt still instead of heavy, and I let out a quiet breath, not realizing until that moment how long I had been holding tension in places I could not even name, and I turned back toward him, my voice softer but more certain than before. "This is yours," I said, not really a question, because everything about it made that clear, and he nodded once, a small movement that carried no need for explanation, and for a second, we just stood there, the silence, stretching between us in a way that did not feel empty, just full of everything I had not figured out yet. And then he moved slightly, gesturing toward a couch near the window. "Sit," he said, not as an order, not sharply, just a simple suggestion that felt easy to follow. And I nodded, lowering myself carefully, my arms still supported, my body finally beginning to register the exhaustion that had been building all night. And as I sat, I became aware of how different this felt from anywhere I had been before, not just the space itself, but the way I felt inside it, like I was not bracing for something to go wrong, like I could actually rest without waiting for the moment it would be taken away. And I leaned back slightly, letting that feeling settle, letting myself exist in it without questioning it immediately. And he remained standing for a moment, watching me with that same steady focus, like he was making sure I was truly settled before moving on. And then he crossed the room, pouring a glass of water from a pitcher on the counter, his movements smooth, deliberate, and he brought it back to me without a word, placing it carefully within reach instead of handing it directly, like he understood I might need to take things at my own pace. And I reached for it after a second, my fingers wrapping around the cool surface, grounding, and I took a small sip, the simple act feeling more significant than it should have, because it was not rushed, not interrupted, just allowed to happen. And when I looked up again, he had taken a seat across from me, not too close, not distant, just enough space to feel balanced. And for a moment we just looked at each other, not in a way that felt intense or overwhelming, just present, like neither of us needed to fill the silence with unnecessary words. And then I spoke, the question coming out before I could stop it. "Why me?" And the words hung there, heavier than anything else I had said so far, because they carried everything behind them, all the confusion, all the disbelief, all the uncertainty about why someone like him would step into my life the way he had. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, considering, and then he leaned back slightly, his posture still composed but more relaxed now. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. "Because you stayed," he said, and I frowned slightly, not understanding right away. And he continued, his eyes not leaving mine. "You had chances to walk away, to ignore what was happening, to pretend it was not real, but you did not." And something about that made my chest tighten, because I had never thought of it that way, never considered that staying could mean anything other than being stuck. And he held my gaze for a second longer before adding, "That matters." And the simplicity of it settled into me slowly, shifting something I had not realized I was carrying. And I looked down at the glass in my hand, the reflection of the light catching on the surface, and I realized that maybe this was not about being chosen in the way I had always feared, not about being pulled into something I could not control, but about being seen for something I had not even recognized in myself. And when I looked back up at him, something in my expression must have changed, because his gaze softened just slightly, not losing its focus but adjusting, like he understood that something had shifted. And in that moment, sitting there in a place that did not feel temporary, with someone who did not feel unpredictable, I realized that this was no longer just about getting through the night. It was about understanding what came next, and for the first time, that did not feel like something to fear. His words stayed with me long after he said them, settling somewhere deeper than I expected, because I had never thought of myself as someone who stayed out of strength, only out of necessity, only out of habit. And now sitting here, in a space that felt more stable than anything I had known before, I realized how much of my life had been shaped by reacting instead of choosing, by enduring instead of understanding. And I lowered my gaze slightly, my fingers still wrapped around the glass, feeling the cool surface against my skin as I tried to process everything that had shifted in such a short amount of time. And the silence between us did not press, did not demand an answer. It allowed the thought to settle, to take form without being interrupted. And I exhaled slowly, lifting my eyes again to meet his, my voice quieter now, but clearer than it had been all night. I did not stay because I was strong, I said, the truth coming out before I could reshape it. And he did not interrupt, did not correct me, just listened, his attention steady in a way that made it easier to keep going. I stayed because I did not know how to leave. And there it was, the part one had not said out loud before, the part one had hidden even from myself. And I felt something shift again as the words settled into the room, because saying it made it real in a different way, made it something I could look at instead of something I had to carry without understanding. And for a moment, he just held my gaze, his expression unchanged on the surface, but something deeper adjusting, like he was recalibrating what he saw. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something firmer in it now, something that did not leave space for doubt. You left tonight, he said, and the simplicity of it hit me harder than I expected, because it was true, not complicated, not layered with conditions, just a fact. And I blinked slightly, the realization settling into me slowly, spreading outward, because I had not framed it that way, had not allowed myself to see it as a decision instead of a reaction. And I let out a breath that felt different, steadier, like something inside me had aligned in a way it had not before, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, acknowledging it, accepting it, and the room felt quieter after that, not empty, just settled, like something important had been placed where it belonged, and I leaned back slightly against the couch, my body finally beginning to relax in a way that felt genuine instead of temporary, the exhaustion now softer, less overwhelming, and I realized that for the first time, I was not trying to predict what would happen next. I was just letting the moment exist, and he watched me for a second longer before speaking again, his tone unchanged but his words carrying a different kind of weight. Tomorrow does not start with fixing everything, he said, and I looked at him, the statement catching my attention immediately, because it challenged the instinct I had always had, the need to solve, to repair, to make everything right as quickly as possible. And he continued, his gaze steady. It starts with not going back. And the words settled into me slowly, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as a boundary, something clear and defined. And I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the glass again, not from fear, but from the realization of what that meant, because not going back was not just about a place, it was about a pattern, a version of my life that I had been living without questioning it. And I swallowed, my voice quieter now, more reflective. And if I try to, I asked, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to understand what would happen if the old instincts pulled me in that direction again. And he did not hesitate this time, his answer immediate, steady. Then I will remind you why you should not, and something in the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not from fear, but from the certainty behind it, because it was not a threat, not control, it was a promise. And I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something, maybe doubt, maybe hesitation, but there was none, just that same unwavering presence that had been there from the moment he stepped into the alley. And I realized that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, it was not something uncertain, it was something defined, something that did not shift without reason. And I let out a slow breath, the tension easing just a little more, and I nodded again, this time more firmly, because I understood now that this was not about being saved in the way I had always imagined. It was about being shown something different and then choosing to stay in it. And as the silence settled around us once more, softer now, more familiar, I realized that tomorrow was no longer something distant or abstract. It was something that had already begun shaping itself in the decisions I was making right now. And for the first time, I felt ready to meet it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke again, and I realized that this kind of silence was no longer something I feared. It was something I could sit inside without feeling like I had to fill it or escape it. And I leaned back slightly, letting my head rest against the couch, my eyes drifting toward the window where the city stretched out beyond the glass. Lights scattered across the night, like something distant and untouchable, and I watched them for a few seconds, letting my thoughts slow, letting everything that had happened settle into something I could hold without it overwhelming me. And I became aware of how different my breathing felt now, steady, even, like my body was finally catching up to the reality that I was safe, at least for this moment. And that realization did not come with hesitation anymore. It came with a quiet acceptance that surprised me. And I let my eyes close for just a second, not to escape, not to avoid anything, just to feel the stillness fully, and when I opened them again, I turned slightly toward him, finding him exactly where I expected, watching me with that same steady focus, like nothing about this moment was temporary to him, like he was not waiting for it to end, and something about that made my chest tighten again, not painfully, just enough to remind me that this mattered, that this was not something I could brush aside later and pretend it had not changed anything. And I shifted slightly, adjusting my position, the support around my arm holding firm, a quiet reminder of everything that had led me here, and I spoke. Before I could second-guess it, my voice soft but certain, I do not think I can go back to the person I was this morning. And the words hung in the air between us, heavier than I expected, because they carried a finality I had not fully acknowledged until I said them out loud. And he did not react immediately, did not rush to respond. He just held my gaze, steady and unshaken, like he had been waiting for me to reach that conclusion on my own. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, grounded. You are not supposed to, he said, and something in that answer settled into me deeper than anything else had so far, because it did not try to pull me back to something familiar. It did not suggest I should hold on to what I had been. It allowed me to move forward without looking over my shoulder, and I exhaled slowly, feeling that truth take shape inside me. And for a moment, I just sat there, letting it exist without questioning it, without trying to analyze it into something smaller. And I realized that this was what had been missing before, not just safety, not just stability, but permission to change without guilt, without fear of what that meant for everything I had left behind. And I looked at him again, more clearly this time, not searching for answers but recognizing something that had been there all along, the consistency, the intention, the quiet certainty that had not wavered from the moment he stepped into the alley. And I understood then that this was not about him controlling anything. It was about him holding a space where things did not fall apart, where choices could exist without being taken away, and that realization shifted something final inside me, something that made everything else feel aligned in a way it had not before. And I let my shoulders relax fully for the first time that night, the tension releasing in a way that felt complete instead of temporary. And I glanced back toward the window, the city still there, unchanged, but I felt different looking at it now, like I was no longer standing on the outside trying to survive it. I was choosing where I stood within it, and that difference mattered more than anything else. And when I turned back to him one last time, my voice was quiet but steady. Then I will not go back, I said, not as a question, not as a hope, but as a decision. And he nodded once, the movement small but certain, like that was all that needed to be said, like everything else would follow from that single choice. And the room fell into silence again. But this time it felt different, not like something waiting to be filled, but like something complete. And as I sat there, no longer bracing, no longer holding back, I realized that the night had not just changed what happened to me, it had changed what I believed was possible. And that was something I could not unlearn, something I would not want to, because for the first time, I was not just surviving what came next, I was choosing it.